It's no secret that the creators of The Lion King haven't been the best at giving fans backstory on characters that they've grown to love, or sometimes even hate. But I never thought I'd consider this next theory as something that was possible. According to the writers themselves, Scar and Mufasa might not actually be brothers. How crazy is that? At the very least, Disney chose to display a pretty strange dynamic between lions in The Lion King when they had both Mufasa and Scar come from the same pride. You see, according to both Nature and Don Hahn, one of the producers of The Lion King, lions have a very interesting leadership dynamic in the real world. According to Don, when the male lion gets old, another rogue lion comes and kills the head of the pride, then the new younger lion kills the king. It doesn't end there though. Don also added that the rogue lion will kill all of the cubs in the pride in order to solidify his takeover and make sure that his genes are the only ones in the pool. In other words, the idea of the lions passing down the leadership role to their firstborn son doesn't really make any sense. It's more of a kill or be killed world for male cubs, meaning that it's unlikely for two brothers to live together for long anyway, let alone far into adulthood. Now, that said, we've also learned through Nature and, once again, Don Hahn himself, that sometimes a pride will have two male lions. This creates an interesting dynamic because the two males clearly wouldn't be equals, and mainly because they wouldn't have the same parents. Once again, implying that lion brothers don't really exist in the wild. In this strange dynamic, though, one lion will clearly take on the leadership role, while the other will always kind of be off by himself in the shadows. According to Don, Disney was trying to use those animal truths to underpin the story, which is why they figured Scar and Mufasa couldn't really be from the same gene pool. That would bring a whole new meaning to the part of the movie where Scar claimed to be from the shallow end of that pool. He may have been in a different pool altogether. Not only would this explain the odd distance that seemed to exist between Scar and Mufasa, but also the physical differences between the two. I mean, they look nothing alike. While Mufasa was shown to have a lighter toned fur with a deep reddish-brown mane, Scar had a much darker tone with a slender and black mane. On top of that, both lions also had very different builds from each other. Where Mufasa was a large and muscular-looking lion, Scar was much more slender and lean. So I would totally buy the idea that both lions came from different families and just grew up together. That said, how would Scar have ended up being so close to Mufasa that they would consider each other brothers if they weren't biologically related, as the movie suggested? Well, the first and arguably most obvious of the theories would be the idea that Scar was adopted into Mufasa's family when he was just a cub. You see, I mentioned before that Scar and Mufasa looked nothing alike, aside from the fact that they were both lions, which would easily imply that they weren't from the same family. So, according to this theory, Scar was originally a cub without a pride. It's unclear how he would have ended up in that situation, but there are a bunch of different ways he could have ended up alone. His pride could have been attacked by another group of lions, and he was forced to run away. Or he may have simply been born to a rogue lion and lioness before being left for dead because they couldn't care for him. Either way, this theory suggests that Scar didn't have a family of his own and was found by a group of Pridelanders when he was wandering through the Outlands in search of food and water. Now, at this point in the timeline, obviously, Ahadi, Mufasa's father, would have been the king, and if he wasn't present when they found Scar, it's likely that the lions would bring the cub to him. The theory suggests that Ahadi spoke with Scar about what he went through, and after realizing that the young lion had no one else to look to, he not only accepted him into the Pridelands, but also into his own family. Interestingly enough, this is similar to a Lion King comic called Simba's New Brother. In the comic, a lone cub named Malka wandered into the Pridelands, and Mufasa planned on taking him into his family if they couldn't find the cub's actual mother. The comic ends with them finding Malka's mother, but it's still cool that Mufasa considered adopting the cub as his own, and if the theory about Scar being adopted into his family was true, then he clearly took a lesson from his father Ahadi. The theory continues by suggesting that Scar joined Ahadi's family and became Mufasa's younger brother, with the two growing up side by side. This is where the theory is similar to the Simba's New Brother comic once again, only with Scar taking on Simba's role. You see, in the comic, Simba became very jealous of Malka and wanted to be an only child. So he went out of his way to basically abandon Malka in the middle of nowhere before ultimately feeling bad and saving him at the last second. As you know from The Lion King, Scar had a very similar jealousy complex toward Mufasa. In fact, it's even mentioned in books like The Lion King: A Tale of Two Brothers that Scar was jealous of Mufasa and his connection with their father. Well, if this theory is accurate, that connection that Scar was seeing between Ahadi and Mufasa came from the fact that they were actually blood relatives and Mufasa was the true heir to the kingdom, where whereas according to the theory, Scar was adopted and therefore wouldn't have any claim to the kingdom. The cool thing about this theory, though, is the fact that because Scar may have been adopted from a very young age, Mufasa would have grown up referring to him as his brother. That could explain why in the movies they will both refer to each other by that title, and it's because they grew up together. Now, as nice of a thought as it is to have a hottie adopt Scar like that, what if the only reason that he took Scar in was because he killed the cub's parents? I know that sounds shocking, but there's a chance that a hottie didn't inherit the Pride Lands as cleanly as you might expect, and in the end, the only reason Scar was still around was an act of mercy. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the way that lions operate in nature is that a rogue lion will try to find a pride that has a weak or elderly leader and kill them. If the rogue succeeds, then he will typically become the leader of the pride and go on a culling of any cubs born by the former leader. Well, according to this theory, a hottie followed the rules of nature on his path to become the king of the Pride Lands. Instead of being born the heir of Pride Rock, it suggested that a hottie was actually a rogue lion who just so happened to be in the right place at the right time. As he was supposedly wandering through the Pride Lands, the idea is that a hottie noticed the pride of lions. More importantly, though, he noticed that the leader seemed to be much older than him, and because of that, he saw an amazing opportunity for himself. According to the theory, a hottie waited until he had the perfect chance to launch an attack on the king of Pride Rock when he was alone, and without anyone to protect him, the feeble old king fell. A hottie stepped in as the new leader of the Pride Lands, and the rest of the lions in the Pride likely knew that things were about to change for them. As lions do in the wild, a hottie would have searched for any male cub that was related to the former king and disposed of them, for lack of a better term. However, according to this theory, the former king's genes were weak, and because of that, he only had one offspring who had only recently been born. A hottie wasn't a bad lion, he was just playing his part in the circle of life when he possibly took over the Pride Lands, and because he couldn't stand the idea of more violence, he chose to spare the young cub. According to this theory, that young cub would grow up to be the villainous Scar that we all know. Now, I know that this would muck up the timeline because Mufasa was meant to be older than Scar, but maybe that's why a hottie usurped the former king when he did. Perhaps he already had a cub on the way and knew that he needed to solidify territory for his family. This cub obviously would have been Mufasa, and because he was born a much healthier lion than Scar was, he grew to be much bigger than him and therefore was perceived as the elder. Now, this theory continues by suggesting that a hottie not only let Scar live, but decided to raise him as one of his own until he was old enough. As you know, though, Scar sadly didn't get the same treatment as Mufasa growing up, and he probably knew that he would never be considered as the future king because of it. When the time came, though, Scar supposedly did something that makes much more sense when you consider him an adopted member of the family. Instead of being happy that Mufasa was going to be the next king, Scar supposedly challenged Mufasa for the throne. It would have been during this fight that Mufasa overpowered Scar and possibly even gave him the wound that left a permanent mark over his eye. This also would have been the fight that was referenced in the live-action version of The Lion King. In the end, though, if this theory is accurate, then Scar and Mufasa would have still grown up to see each other as brothers, which is why they referred to each other as such in the movies. Now, the real question is, do you think any of these theories could be accurate? Were Scar and Mufasa only brothers by title and not by blood? Or were they actually from the same gene pool? Be sure to let me know in the comments below.